Welcome to session 332 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 28th of November. Today we'll be looking at Philemon and Psalm 22. But first of all, let's get an overview of Philemon. We come to this last letter that is attributed to Paul, and it's also one of his shortest. It is one of Paul's undisputed letters, meaning no one disagrees it was written by Paul. Paul wrote this letter to Philemon while in prison, though there is some debate about when. We know Paul is in prison, have a look at Philemon verse 9, but the question is which time? Was it when he was in prison in Ephesus, which was about 55 to 56 CE? Or when he was imprisoned in Caesarea, which was 57 to 59 CE? Or was it when he was imprisoned in Rome, which was about the early 60s CE? We don't know where Philemon lived, but we have a reason to suspect it was in or near Colossae, as there are parallels between this letter and the letter to the Colossians. Both mention Timothy as a co-sender. Have a look at Colossians 1 verse 1 and Philemon verse 1. Both mention Epaphras. Have a look at Colossians 1 verse 7 and Philemon verse 23. Both mention someone called Archippus, Colossians 4 verse 17 and Philemon verse 2. And both mention Onesimus, which is the focus of this letter. Have a look at Colossians 4 verse 9 and Philemon verse 10. Because of this, some suggest the letter to the Colossians and this letter were sent together, which would potentially date this letter in the early 60s CE. Here is a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. But we start with verses 1 to 7, the greetings, thanks and prayer, and verses 8 to 20, Paul's request, and then finally verses 21 to 25, closing greetings. The focus of this letter is Onesimus. He was a slave that was owned by Philemon that ran away. Paul encountered him and took him under his wing, but he's now sending Onesimus back to Philemon with this letter. Paul writes to Philemon to encourage him to not only forgive Onesimus, but to accept him back, not as a slave, but as a brother. But let's jump into today's reading, Philemon. Paul opens with his usual greetings, as well as a thanksgiving and prayer. Paul is grateful for the love that Philemon shares with all believers, and for the faith that he has in Jesus. Because of this, Paul prays that this will continue and that Philemon will be effective in sharing this faith with others. The Greek word for sharing here is koinonia, and it carries with it a sense of fellowship. This faith is something that Philemon participates in with others. It's not a solo affair. We saw it used a lot in Philippians to talk about the partnership and unity believers have with Jesus. Have a look at Philippians 1 verse 5, 2 verse 1 and 3 verse 10. This is noteworthy because of how Paul draws on this idea of unity and partnership in the rest of the letter. Paul has been greatly encouraged to hear that Philemon has been an encouragement to others in the church. And so Paul jumps into the meat of his letter. It is because of the great love that Philemon has shown that Paul now writes his letter. He could try to compel Philemon to do what is right, but Paul would much rather appeal to the love that Philemon is already showing. Paul is writing on behalf of Onesimus, who has become like a son to Paul while he has been in prison. As a slave to Philemon, Onesimus was useless. But since then, he's not only been useful to Paul, but Paul seems to think he can be useful to Philemon. If Paul could, he would keep Onesimus with him for support, but he recognises that there is some unresolved tension. So he is sending Onesimus back in the hope that the two can resolve their issues in good spirits. Paul even speculates that this might be why God allowed Onesimus to run away in the first place, so that he could grow under Paul and then return to Philemon, not as a slave, but as a brother. And so Paul finally brings the request. He asks Philemon to accept Onesimus now as a brother, just as he would Paul. As his master, Philemon has every right in the Greco-Roman world to punish Onesimus harshly for abandoning him. But Paul is asking Philemon to respond not according to his rights, but according to his love. We then see Paul embody the gospel. If there is any debt owed by Onesimus to Philemon, let Paul pay it. In this, Paul embodies Jesus, who was willing to allow any sense of debt caused by our sin to be attributed to him, so that we might now experience freedom. Paul assures Philemon that it would mean a lot to him if he would do this. He then asks Philemon to prepare a room for him for the next time he visits and shares some final greetings. So far in Paul's letters, we've read as slavery has been mentioned a lot. See 1 Corinthians 7, Ephesians 6, 1 Timothy 6 and Titus 2. In all these mentions, the focus has been on not letting the young Christian faith be co-opted by a slave liberation movement. Instead, slaves should do what they can to model God to their masters and vice versa. This has been Paul's general stance to the churches. But when faced with the specific scenario, Paul is able to give a more personal and nuanced response. Yes, Onesimus was a slave, and yes, Philemon has every right to punish him and enslave him again, but he shouldn't. Instead, he should now accept Onesimus as his own brother with forgiveness and love. This one specific example isn't going to jeopardize the future of Christianity, and it should and did serve to future generations of the ideal that should be worked towards. This letter also serves as a great lesson for general rules and guidance versus applications in specific situations. Paul's previous guidelines were good for the time. They would allow the Christian faith time to survive and establish itself without being co-opted or stamped out, and while still demonstrating the transformative power of the gospel. But in the specific lives of Onesimus and Philemon, Paul could bring in a better and more nuanced response that more fully embodies the gospel in the lives of these two men. In the same way, there are practices and guidelines that are good and beneficial as recommendations for the church. But when it comes to individual situations, they have to be taken on their own merits to identify the best way to embody the gospel in those situations. But that is the letter to Philemon. Now let's look at Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is one of the most famous lament psalms. It is the psalm that Jesus quoted on the cross, Matthew 27 verse 46. Biblical lament is whenever a person takes their pains, hurts and frustrations before God. It tends to include 4 steps: turning to God, bringing the complaint before God, making a request of God, and then declaring trust in God. Throughout this psalm, we see the psalmist go back and forth between each of these steps, sometimes complaining about their sufferings, other times asking God to do something. And then we get moments of trusting in God before turning back to the suffering again. This psalm is attributed to King David, and it's a psalm that is rich and full of meaning and layers. The structure of the psalm is a chiasm, where the passage mirrors itself. So we start with verses 1 to 2, God feels absent. Verses 3 to 5, but God delivered our ancestors. Verses 6 to 8, yet I am worthless. Verses 9 to 11, do not forget me, God of my youth. Verses 12 to 13, my enemies surround me. And then we have verses 14 to 15, my strength is worn out. Verses 16 to 18, my enemies surround me. Verses 19 to 23, to deliver me from my enemies. Verses 24 to 25, God is faithful. Verses 26 to 27, people will praise God. And then verses 28 to 31, God is king. While the idea of complaining to God can offend a lot of Christians today, it is a deep-rooted history in the Bible. Here the psalmist is letting God know that it feels like he has been abandoned. Why has God forsaken them? It's like he doesn't answer them. The psalmist then pulls themselves back a little by focusing on God's past record. God saved and delivered their ancestors. They were able to trust in him and never be put to shame. But then turning back to their own life, the two don't seem to line up. The psalmist's ancestors may not have been put to shame, but they sure have. They have been mocked and despised, and all for putting their trust in God. And again, the psalmist tries to pull themselves back from the pit of despair. They remind themselves and God of all the times that they have been able to trust God in the past. This leads them to ask God to be close to them through these struggles. Then the psalmist mentions the strong bulls of Bashan, that's Psalm 22 verse 12. This reference might be lost to us, but at the time it carried a lot of meaning. Bashan was the place north of Israel that was linked to the spiritual rebellion. It was where a lot of cultic worship happened in the northern kingdom, and is also believed to be the site of one of 2 golden calves made by the northern kingdom. Have a look at 1 Kings 12 verses 25 to 33. For some it was seen as the gateway to hell. So for the psalmist, the bulls of Bashan would have been the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of saying the hounds of hell. It feels like the very forces of death and darkness were surrounding them, which brings us to the psalmist's lowest point. Their strength is gone, and they feel wasted away. It's at this point that the structure begins to reflect itself. Just as the psalmist felt surrounded by death and darkness, they are also surrounded by a more tangible threat of enemies seeking to destroy them. But now they finally reached a point where they can reach out and hold properly to God in the midst of their pain. Just as they had previously asked God to not forget them, the psalmist now asked that God defeat their enemies. While they had only been able to focus on their own worthlessness, now they turn to God's goodness and faithfulness. Where God had been faithful to ancestors of the past, the psalmist of the present and others will praise God now and forever. The psalm begins with a confession that it feels like God is absent and his people groan, unable to find rest. It now ends with the declaration that God is king and his people shall prosper. Psalm 22 is an incredible lament psalm that works through some of the deepest suffering and turmoil one can experience. But all the way through it models for us how to wrestle with these things, so that we can ultimately stand in who God is and trust in his goodness. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.